Welcome to this video. In this clip, we're looking at clause 8.4 of ISO 9001, control of externally provided processes, products and services. It's in three parts. The first one, general, sets out a requirement for, making sure that the products and services meet the requirements of the business, including customer requirements. Then secondly, the type and extent of control. And lastly, the information for external providers. So we take them separately. The first subclause, the organization shall ensure that externally provided processes, products and services conform to requirements. So in many cases that can be quite straightforward, but you've got to keep in mind your own set of requirements. There could be very specific and unique requirements for products and services supplied by external providers. So that just has to be borne in mind. The organization shall determine the controls to be applied to externally provided processes, products and services when A, products and services from external providers are intended for incorporation into the organization's own products and services. So that could be material inputs, but it also could be the use of particular competencies. B, products and services are provided directly to the customer by external providers on behalf of the organization. So you could be using a subcontractor to deliver on your behalf. Many of our clients deliver products to organizations, and they would require subcontractors to either deliver or maybe fit certain products. So I'm thinking of those of you who will be in the office supplies, in the construction sector, security sector. So you would be, involved in selling a product where you use subcontractors to fit or deliver the product. Fulfillment houses need to be considered in that regard. Part C, where the organization is involved in delivering a process or part of a process. So where a process or part of a process is provided by an external provider as a result of a decision by the organization. So that's where you outsource directly. Okay, lastly, the organization shall determine and apply criteria for the evaluation, selection, monitoring of performance, and re-evaluation of external providers based on their ability to provide processes or products and services in accordance with requirements. The organization shall retain the usual documented information. Generally, when you first take on a new supplier, there will be some kind of criteria that needs to be established, and an auditor will look that you've used that criteria to evaluate that particular supplier. I would pay particular attention to technical criteria, particularly where testing of products needs to be carried out prior to making the decision. So your evaluation of the process will include technical and test requirements. So it's just something to bear in mind. The requirement for documentation, as with all parts of the standard, really is to demonstrate that you do this to a good effect, and what you're looking for is to have a standard set of criteria that would be, I suppose, appropriate and proportionate to the nature of the work and the nature of the external providers' products and services. So I suppose, you're looking at all of your suppliers, but with this rule of thumb. Most auditors are not really too interested in office consumables, stationery, that kind of thing, unless it's part of your process, unless it's part of your deliverable to your client. So the focus here needs to be on those external providers, including subcontractors, where they're actively involved in the delivery of products and services to your customers. With that in mind, I'd just like to take a pause and maybe look at the type and extent of controls in just a moment. Okay, so we've just been looking at 841, where we set out the criteria for maintaining conformance through our supply chain. And for those of you who are interested in supply chain security, you've got to keep in mind that once we've decided, the types of service providers and products, service providers that need to be controlled, now we've got to determine the type and the extent of the control as per clause 842. So let's have a look at the criteria and we can discuss them. The organisation shall ensure that externally provided processes, products and services do not adversely affect the organisation's ability to consistently deliver conforming products and services to its customers. So it's a very high level requirement. But then it kind of specifies a few particular parameters. The organisation shall A, ensure that externally provided processes remain within the control of its quality management system. So you can outsource the work, but you can't outsource the oversight, is the way to think of that. B, define both the controls that it intends to apply to an external provider and those it intends to apply to the resulting output. So, there are controls for maybe the evaluation, the selection, and to govern the delivery of the product and service. And then after the delivery, there is a control then for testing the resulting output of that delivery to make sure it remains conformant. C, take into consideration 1, the potential impact of externally provided processes, products and services on the organization's ability to consistently meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. A big mouthful, but once again, it's requirements. So the potential impact on your ability to consistently meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. So there's that differentiation to be considered between statutory and regulatory. 2, the effectiveness of the controls applied to the external provider. So not only have you to place controls to make sure that the external provider delivers to a conformant set of criteria, there's also a consideration for the effectiveness of those controls. So that's, it's very hard to be specific to your particular business without knowing exactly what you do and the nature of your work. Okay, D, determine the verification or other activities necessary to ensure that the externally provided processes, products and services meet requirements. So that could be, an evaluation after the delivery. It could be throughout a fit-out project, for example. It could be spot checks along the way. In the print world, there will be on a large run of delivering, say, the finishing department is looking at, processing 100,000 brochures that need to be collated, folded, stitched, packed, and sent off to dispatch. Well, it's how many spot checks do you need on a run? So in 100,000, there's 1 per 1,000 or 1 per 5,000 maybe along the way that you take a check and make sure it meets all of the design specifications. So, it's just kind of one part, but then you've got the external part for type and extent of control can mean you, for example, where you might have a fulfillment house or an external printer who prints and delivers leaflets on your behalf. Well, maybe you need to go and visit them and carry out an audit at their site for how they're looking after your work. And that's quite commonplace in the ISO community. That external auditor where you might get somebody like ourselves at Enable ISO to go out to your suppliers on your behalf and maybe carry out an inspection of the premises or how they're processing a product for you or how indeed they're managing your data within their systems. And that's a more frequent query that we respond to. So I think one of the things that we'd just like to say in summary for this clause is, really the company, your organization retains a certain amount of autonomy about how you're going to apply this. But you've got to keep in mind that the more you rely on an external provider, the more control you are expected to put in place. So it's that proportionality and appropriateness that has to be considered. Don't forget, you can always contact us for a little bit of consultancy. So we'll move on now to the next clause. So looking now at clause 843, information for external providers. One of the things that we have to consider here is, once we've decided who we need to do business with and for what purpose, which is 841, and then in 842, the types of controls we need to have over that service and product provision. And then we have to then consider, well, how are we going to engage with these people? What's the nature of the relationship and how formal do we need to be? I think when we're considering across all of the standards, we have to be very mindful of information security, regardless of whether we're going for ISO 27001. So it's important to consider, contractual arrangements really is the best way to communicate information for external providers. Because there could be a requirement to include non-disclosure agreement, and there could also be a requirement for a data processing clause within that service level agreement. So be thinking contractual arrangements when you're reading through and trying to understand, information for external providers. The best way to communicate it is by contract. The organization shall ensure the adequacy of requirements prior to their communication to the external provider. That's an internal mechanism just to kind of make sure that you've got everything nailed. So look after, your own, be clear in what you want from the provider prior to engaging with them, because if you're not clear, that's where you start to lose out, and you start to be, the nature of the relationship develops based on what they want it to be rather than what you need it to be. So the organization shall communicate to external providers its requirements for A, the processes, products and services to be provided. That clarity is required to satisfy that. B, the approval of 1, products and services, 2, methods, processes and equipment, 3, the release of products and services. So just to reflect back on, preceding videos throughout the whole series, specification is important here, because it's really about making sure that there's an element of conformity that's understood and clear as part of the trading relationship. And then the release of products and services. So what is acceptable as an output of the relationship? What is to be delivered and how? C, competence, including any required qualification of persons. There's no point in saying I want a courier company to deliver if there's the need for additional skills of the driver, for example, and then expect for those skills to be available without negotiating. Likewise, competency of individuals might be by specifying the particular qualification. So there could be a need for somebody at a chartered engineer level rather than engineer, or senior in some way with regard to experience, or particular experience to do with the application of the work. I guess it's very hard to be very specific without knowing your own business, but you have to consider the requirements, back up to the opening sentence of this particular clause. The organization shall ensure the adequacy of requirements prior to their communication to the external provider. So you would have to think about the qualifications of the individuals carrying out the work on the organization's behalf. D, the external provider's interactions with the organization. So what are the expectations? I mean, if you think in commercial terms, it's, when is invoicing going to occur, and what can you invoice for? What's excluded? There's something, is mileage included if you're driving, or is there just an allowance? So you have to think of your own situation and try and apply it accordingly. Um, Control of monitoring of external providers' performance to be applied by the organization. I think you can combine that with the previous one, because that interactions with and the monitoring requirement, and the verification and validation, that could be through site meetings and reporting that you decide that you're going to set up as part of the contractual arrangements. So without going into extensive detail, where there would be a need to have some understanding of your own individual organization's requirements, I think the overall take from the entirety of Clause 8.4 is that, first of all, the nature of the relationships with your external providers is twofold. There are direct inputs into processes which you receive delivery of and then use as part of your own delivery of products and services to your clients, customers, and so on. And then there are those where you outsource work to third parties, either for the delivery of your complete products and services, or to take part in the actual delivery of those products and services, whether it be by dispatch and fulfillment, or whether it be by some kind of processing or construction fit out kind of work. So be mindful of the criticality and complexity rule, that you document things to the extent necessary, dependent on the nature of the relationship with the third party. And you would use that reliance on that organization, or the criticality and the complexity of the relationship would determine the extent of the control to some degree. And please keep in mind, however, that the auditor's expectation is for you to have something of a formal approach to the validation and verification of performance. So the extent of control, again, is very important. And it's quite commonplace for people to have quite detailed questionnaires to open up a relationship, and subsequently, particularly with regard to data protection and data processing arrangements. So if you need any help, please go to the website. There's a lot of information available in the FAQ and in the knowledge library and in the ISO explained sections. And also, don't forget the chat box. You can ask questions through there or contact us directly by email. Once again, thank you very much, and keep up the good work.